Good evening, everyone, or I think it's still afternoon-ish. My name is Abdi Latif. I am the East Africa correspondent for the New York Times. I would like to welcome you all to this session, which is going to talk about empowering local journalists. Many of us, either in this room, in this festival, and on this panel, report from all over the world. And when we do those reportings, we travel to countries that we've never been to places that sometimes we are strangers in, and we depend on stringers, fixers, local journalists to be able to help us tell the stories of those communities. Those stringers, those local journalists usually have in-depth knowledge about the countries that they live in. They speak multiple languages, they understand context, and they're very crucial to telling what is supposed to be an accurate reflection on the reality on the ground. And we want to talk a bit about that today and be able to say how should foreign journalists approach and empower local journalists. We want to answer questions. We might not have all the answers at the end of the session, but we want to try and at least explore questions around how do we advocate for those journalists? How do we work with them? What are the power dynamics that we are walking into when we walk into these rooms or spaces with them? And the people on this panel have a lot of that experience. To my left is Aida Alami, who is a Moroccan reporter based in Rabat, Morocco, and Paris, and who mainly covers migration and human rights. She has reported from North and West Africa, the Middle East, Europe, the United States. Heidi, she wrote an essay in a fantastic collection that I would recommend that you all read called Our Women on the Ground, Essays by Arab Women Reporting from the Arab World, that gives voice to women from the region reporting on countries they are from. She has experienced both sides of foreign reporting, working with Western correspondents in Morocco, but also later in life doing that kind of reporting herself in places she was not from. We have Pavni Mittal. She's an international broadcast journalist. She's currently a correspondent for Al Jazeera and has also reported and been on air for other national and foreign television networks like CNBC, PBS NewsHour, and ENCA in South Africa. And Asha Rajvanshi is a staff writer for Time magazine. She's based in London, and she covers international news and affairs. She was previously working in India as an independent journalist and a fellow for the Institute of Current and World Affairs. I want this, we all want this to be a conversation, and we all want, I'm gonna leave ample time at the end so that you can all ask your questions, participate, give your comments. But I wanna start with you, Ida, in terms of when you think about a local journalist, what comes to mind? Could you maybe define what a local journalist is?
By the way, thank you for doing this. Abdi has been reporting on Sudan all day, and now he's doing the hard work on this panel. Thank you. And he's
the easy part. I'm going to ask hard questions, so you're doing a lot of hard work.
Sure. So to me, a local journalist is essentially someone who's from a place, knows intimately a place, reports on it all the time, speaks the language, speaks the culture, understands nuances, really is embedded in the field they're working on. And very often these journalists in a foreign reporting context are the ones correspondents heavily rely on when they go somewhere. So let's say someone from the United States goes to Morocco, they look for someone who's really plugged in, has the right contacts, understands the story, and they're incredibly important to understand how foreign reporting works. It wouldn't be possible without these people. And a lot of the stuff I believe in is giving more credit and elevating more these kinds of journalists.
Mm-hmm. And you've reported in many places that you are not born in or like had been before, like Haiti. Mm-hmm. Could you talk a bit about your experience, like, you know, when you were flying there or going there, like what was in your mind? How were you thinking about the person that you're going to work with?
Of course, because as you said in the introduction, I've been on both sides of the relationship. So I've been the person that worked with a foreign correspondent who came to Morocco. They didn't speak the language, they didn't really know Morocco. We paired up. And for example, I started my career a little bit before the Arab Spring, and I worked with a lot of correspondents where the readers never knew I was even involved in the story. So I've been on that side. So later on, when I started going myself to other countries, I always kept that in mind. And some of the things I started doing, as I say, when I went to Haiti, is I read every book I could find on Haiti before, to the point that the first time I landed in Port-au-Prince, I felt that I had been there before. I had read so much about it. But also I worked with Haitian reporters, and there were different kind of people I worked with when I was in Haiti. There were the extremely skilled Haitian reporters, and we shared credit on the stories. And then sometimes I just needed translation from Creole to French. I would just find someone who spoke Creole, spoke French, and I would pay them for a couple of hours of work, which to me is not the same thing. I don't feel comfortable asking a journalist to translate for me unless it's absolutely necessary. Mm-hmm. So I always try to find a balance between hiring a translator versus working with a journalist in an equal partnership.
Mm-hmm. Asta, you are a Time magazine, and you sort of like cover a huge swath of issues, and so could you talk a little bit about like local journalists, like how do you approach that question, particularly international journalism?
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Abdi, and thanks everyone for being here. I can talk about when I started as a freelancer in India, and the relationship of local journalism and the work that I was doing was very interesting, because I was from India, but I hadn't lived there and worked there as a reporter until I moved back. And it was kind of strange, because when I was writing for publications like Time, before I started working for them, I would very much look to local reporters, and India is such a diverse place that you don't speak every language in India. So I was going to a place like Kerala, where I didn't speak Malayalam, and I was getting the help of Malayali journalists. And I think what it kind of taught me was that although you can be from a place, you may not necessarily be equipped to report on it accurately, and the only way that you can really do that is by talking to as many people as possible. And local journalists, I think, are really crucial in that, because they immerse themselves in their communities so much, and they are so passionate about the work that they do that all I could really do was kind of learn from them and that experience. And when I was publishing that story for Time, I kind of went back to my editors and said, look, this person was really crucial to getting this information, both in translation and also in understanding the context. Is there a way that we can recognize them? I don't mind if it's a dual byline or if we can just give them acknowledgement at the bottom. And pleasantly, I was surprised to learn that Time anyway gives them a byline, so that was good. But I think there are publications that won't always want to do that, especially very prestigious international ones. So I think it's important to have that conversation with your editors from the beginning. You know, what role can local journalists play if we're going to have a partnership in the reporting itself?
I want to follow up on something that you talked about, and like if you're from a place, which is in my case the scenario, like, you know, I was born in Kenya, I come from Kenya, and I cover that region right now, and I was wondering, like, if there are ways in which you question some of, like, you know, your own biases when you're like reporting, like you think that you know a place, but do you really know a place? Could you talk a bit about your experience on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, because I think that the diaspora has a lot of I would say journalists of color are actually from the diaspora community, so they go back to their countries, and there's a feeling of both familiarity but also maybe some distance. And for me, it was very important to be honest about what I didn't know, the gaps in my knowledge, and kind of tell the people that I was speaking to, look, I don't know everything, and I'm happy for you to sort of tell me what you know. And, you know, at the end of the day, I think objectivity is a whole other conversation, but I think if you can kind of acknowledge that in your reporting, or if you can try and fill those gaps of knowledge by other people telling you what they think, then I think that's like one way to address that. But I think it's always a learning experience.
Okay, great. And Pavni, you work in broadcast journalism, which I think the people on the rest of the panelists don't. Could you talk a bit about like the nuances of like working with like local journalists? How do you approach that within, you know, whether it's with local broadcast networks or international broadcast networks?
Yeah, so in broadcast lingo, you usually call them fixers or stringers. I prefer the word producers because they are really critical to our reporting. You know, sometimes you have, you know, there's breaking news and you have to fly in and you want someone there at the airport with the right car because you have equipment and you need someone who can figure out like, okay, which is the best hotel so that we have all the facilities we need to turn a piece around on the day. Like it has to have great Wi-Fi. You know, we need to have access to the places we want to go to. We also, and sometimes we're using, you know, producers while we're sitting at the bureau and we need elements coming in because we can't go there or it's going to take like 12 hours for us to fly. And I think the difference between having a good piece which has elements or like sound bites or visuals that you actually want versus one that, you know, something that comes from agencies, which is, you know, great, but what your competitors also have is that local producer who is equipped. And it's very difficult because in broadcast, you ideally want someone who's, you know, super person, superman or superwoman who can film, who has contacts and will turn things around and meet the standards, you know, your ethical and journalistic standards. And the fact is you don't have that everywhere. So in an ideal situation, like what we have in our bureau is we have someone in Indian-administered Kashmir, which is a very dangerous place for journalists, but also there's just so much always happening. And we have someone who films just beautifully. And with him, I know that whatever he gives me will be great. But then we haven't been able to invest so much in people in, say, all parts of India, where I was posted for many months. And then that becomes the trick. How do you find people? And sometimes you work with people from local newspapers or local TV channels. But I think a lot more work needs to go into sort of identifying them early and kind of training them so that you get what you need. And they also get the opportunity to showcase their work at a bigger stage.
Yes, could you talk a bit about like what the training could look like? Maybe like you found somebody, all of a sudden there's a news, you know, breaking in somewhere, you know, usually you don't have someone. Like, how do you find someone, how do you equip them with those skills quite quickly so that they're able to also deliver, you know, could you talk a bit about that? Do you have an example?
Honestly, it's just last minute hustle. Like I want to say there's like method to that madness, but it's mostly like, okay, we got to go and we need to find someone. And I also have a producer whose job it is to do that. So a lot of times like, you find someone and if that doesn't work, it's your fault and I can do that and I use that privilege. Okay. But a lot of times, like I have worked without a producer, I think there are certain things you need. One is just someone who's, who like knows the area, who probably has some background in reporting. So sometimes you're just looking at news stories and you find some names, you contact them. A lot of it in journalism is word of mouth. So people you know who know each other. It's actually a very small world, a small community, like we all fit in Perugia, you know? So that kind of a scenario. So we've had that, and I think you also have to be fair, because what I expect from Umar, who's a stringer in Kashmir, I can't expect from someone who's just working with us, because he's been with us for years. So I think you also have to be fair in your expectations and sort of be nice. That goes a long way.
Yeah, thank you. Ida, could you talk a little bit about the power dynamics in terms of like people going into some of these spaces and how you sort of like either handle those, or what are some of the things that you've faced?
Sure. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is when you work, let's say you're the local journalist, you work in a place where press freedom is limited. I'll talk about Morocco, for example. Morocco is not a place where you can go without a film permit. Morocco is a place where a lot of journalists are in prison. It's just not a place that you can navigate like you're reporting in New York. It's just not that kind of place. And very often I have these conversations where I'm like, can you think about your sources? Can you think about the fact that you're going to come in, you're going to do this story, you're going to leave, and what's going to happen to your sources? It's like, it's not just the imbalance of the partnership that's very unequal very often, because of course not everything is black or white. Of course there are some, I've worked with incredible foreign reporters who came into Morocco and were knowledgeable and knew the story they wanted to do, and we kind of worked together the story. But there are also many that they just come in, they're hoping the local journalist they've hired is going to figure it out for them. They don't really care about sharing the credit. They don't really care about what it means for the local reporter, who will stay behind when they leave, or about the safety of their sources, impact of the story, and so on. I don't know if that answers, but...
Asta, do you want to pitch in there and maybe just talk a bit about like finding, once you found these people, like, you found a local journalist you're working with, either you've flown in there, or like you even sometimes, as a lot of us do, like even reporting remotely, right? How do you think about those power dynamics, let's say even on a virtual basis?
Yeah, virtual is interesting because I haven't yet done a story where I've put someone's life in danger virtually, but I would say that when I am calling people up from my desk in London and writing about a different country, then, you just kind of, I think in any story, whether it's virtual or personal, I think you just have to be really transparent about what the story is and if it's going to be a dangerous story, what its consequences could be. Because when I was, for example, reporting at a coal mine, it was a very heavily surveilled coal mine by the conglomerate, and they were patrolling the area constantly, asking people, what's your business here? And the people that it was going to impact at the end of the day, journalists would come and leave, were the villagers who were living in those communities and were constantly bearing the brunt of any reporting that was coming out of that local village. So I think in that aspect, when I was using the help of there was a local student there who was studying there, and he was kind of living there day to day. And after I left, the police came and asked him, like, who was this girl? Why was she there? I think it's like very important in those situations to be like, look, this is where it's going to be published. This is what the impact might be. This is what I'm trying to do with my reporting. And I know that I can't always guarantee that it's not going to have a negative impact in some way, but the hope is that the journalism will at least raise awareness about what's going on in this area. And oftentimes people, if they feel like they can trust you or they know what's coming, they'll be happy to share that information with you, or they'll be happy to work with you. But I think if they don't know, then that's where the problems arise, basically. And I wanted to say, like, also on the flip side of working with local journalists is the few times that I worked with some student who was like in college and really wanted to get a byline, or someone who was writing for their local newspaper, there's a vast gap of knowledge as to how to get to the next level of pitching to an international publication. And I think in that way, like, we can play a really good part in sort of giving them those tools and equipping them with the resources. I shared a bunch of pitches that I had pitched to editors with them, and they had no idea that they were supposed to say this, this, and this in one pitch. And I think if you're going to work with those journalists and try to also give them that information so that they can actually become you in, like, a few months' time.
One of the things that we've done with like stories in sensitive places across East Africa is we sometimes do not put the photographers' names on like the photos, or sometimes like we actually would not even credit, if I work with like a local reporter, like we would not credit them until maybe they leave the country. And then after they leave the country, like, we would actually add the byline, whether it's days or months later. Sometimes, like, we've also had scenarios where somebody would like work with us and like just would be like, he or she would not want even like a byline or like a contributor line deliberately, because they know they want to continue living in that country and continue to help us report. And so in many ways, like, there's a lot of like these power dynamics that you're always negotiating. And Pavni, I was wondering, like, how does that play out in broadcast journalism? at least in your experience?
So the thing with broadcast is in television, you don't actually share bylines at all. It's like the correspondent's name and face, and there are many aspects to it because you have that story that goes out at the end of the day, but you also have, stuff like live shots that you have through the day that you're doing. Our concern sometimes is the opposite, when a lot of local journalists don't want to be formally associated, because a lot of times people are moonlighting, so they don't want their organizers to find out. So I get very strict instructions from my producer saying, don't get overexcited and tag this person, okay, you can't do this. And I said, okay, we'll be careful. Sometimes also, the thing with broadcast is if you go to a sensitive area, you can't really hide or pretend to be anything else because you have this massive camera and equipment. So sometimes you have to be careful because we are going to go away, and you also have some sort of protection in terms of, the organization you come from. You can go on social media and say, this is what happened to me, and there's also like class difference sometimes. But what I do see changing, especially in some sensitive areas, is you are hiring the local journalist or stringer, producer, whoever, whatever you want to call them. They're also sometimes now hiring you because there've been many incidents where, their lives have been endangered, or, they've had, security come in and sort of catch hold of them because, foreign correspondents are slightly harder to catch hold of, and governments especially local governments don't necessarily want to get into that. So I think that is changing, and I think that's very good because even as foreign reporters, whether it's us or it's someone flying in from a different country, people do have a tendency, especially, to be really honest, in third world countries, to sort of bend visa rules, for example. I think there's a feeling for a lot of people that, we can do whatever because we'll get out. And, in broadcast, you tend to do stories to build your profile and all of that. But I think on the ground, especially in regions where there is a lot of conflict and where you see a lot of people parachuting in, you are seeing a lot of journalists who are seasoned as producers or stringers there sort of stand up for themselves and say, no, I will not work with this organization because it's not okay for me.
I'm going to turn to the audience in a minute, but Ida, I just wanted to know, you do this incredible program where you pair up foreign correspondents with local reporters and sort of tease out what that relationship looks like and explore that. Could you talk a bit about that?
Sure. So I've been teaching this journalism course for 11 years now, where I take one journalism student in the US and I pair them with a student in a country. So it can be Morocco, or most recently I go to Greece. And for instance, in Greece, my students from the American University are with young refugees who are reporting on their community. And the idea is that because I write about migration and I teach migration reporting, the idea is that, okay, you're going to be writing about people who are impacted by politics of migration and so on. Why don't you work with one who, that's their lives, that's what they know, and I find that equal partnership extremely interesting, because on one side, you have someone with a completely fresh look who's going to see things that maybe when you're deeply into a topic you don't see anymore, or a different perspective, and that's extremely interesting too. And also respect and understand that the person they're working with is their eyes and ears. I always tell them that. I always tell them your local partner is your eyes and ears. They're not your translator. They're not your assistant. You have to have conversations together. You have to decide together how you're going to report a story, and there are things, for instance, when I've reported in, let's say, in Creole, okay, the person who's talking to me is looking at the person who speaks Creole. They're not looking at me. I'm not understanding their sense of humor. I'm missing out on so many things, even if they're translating, I don't know, if they're being funny, I'm not able to know that. That's why that equal partnership is so important, for these little things that we tell our readers, these little observations, understanding what a tag means on a wall, understanding if they're eating at a certain hour that's actually unusual. You know, these little things that make stories so interesting to read and so interesting to tell. And I really try to get young journalists to understand, please, like, it's fine to report on a country you don't know, just respect the fact that you don't know it.
Can I just jump in? The only other thing I wanted to say was that there used to be this idea that you couldn't, you wanted to be the person getting the story from a new place, and your publication was breaking an exclusive. But I feel like now we should encourage our editors, and also in our reporting, crediting local newspapers when they find information, because they're often the first source of that information. And it is okay to say, this local publication from this town reported on this first, and we're just expanding on that coverage. Because I think there was a tendency in the US for publications to be like, no, our reporter's there on the ground, so let's just say that this is our reporting, when a lot of the brunt of that is coming from people on the ground writing for their smaller newspapers.
Pavni, do you want to weigh in terms of how we can do better?
Yeah, I think the distinction actually starts, it's like semantics, it starts in our head. When we think foreign correspondent, we have a certain type, and we think local journalist, we have a certain type, because we believe foreign is bigger than local. But I think when you realize that you're all just partners, especially in broadcast, because it really is a team sport, I can't do it solo. I mean, I'd like to believe I can, but I really can't. So I think if we just sort of erase that distinction in our head, I think a lot of what we discuss in terms of power dynamics and unfair practices, that sort of will just go away.
Yeah, it was interesting when I was working as a freelancer, I started off by saying freelance journalist, and then I changed it to independent journalist, and suddenly people's perception of that changed, but the work was the same. And I feel like it kind of goes to your point of use whatever title you want. I don't think it matters as long as your work is kind of speaking for itself in that respect, and maybe change your byline from local reporter to independent reporter. It wouldn't make a difference, but to editors in the US, maybe they'll think of that as oh, this person's more international in that respect.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. I promised I was gonna give ample time to the audience. We have 25 minutes, so comments, best practices, questions, we'll take them now. Do we have a microphone going around? I think there's a microphone there. Oh, yeah, there.
Hi. So I was thinking about how collaborative journalism can sort of bridge these power, dynamics in terms of, you've touched on a little bit on the partnership, but most of the time what I do worry about, because I'll just introduce myself, sorry.
Yes, I was just gonna say, yes, exactly.
My name is Halima Salat. I'm originally also from Kenya. I live in the Netherlands. I'm now with Lighthouse Reports. I don't know if any of you know. And I do like the idea that these nuances, even whether it's the diaspora or whether you're collaborating with somebody on the ground, that I feel like collaborative is maybe I'm selling the idea of collaborative, I don't know. But what are your thoughts about how collaboration can be the next way to balance out these power dynamics? Thank you.
Do you want to take, we'll take maybe another question, and then we can, yeah, here.
Hello, thank you for a really great panel. My name's Laura, and I'm a freelance journalist, and one of my many hats is helping to manage a community, an international community of freelance journalists. And our members outside of the US and Europe, one of the biggest barriers they tend to face is that they want to break into more international media because the pay is better. But often that international media is in English, and that is not their first language. So I'm not asking you for solutions to this, but I would love any thoughts on, and it was great to hear you talking about sharing pictures, but how can we encourage newsrooms and editors to, this is a very British phrase, to take more of a punt on the fact that a story is really solid, but you might need to work more with that freelancer to help them because they're reporting in a different language for you, or writing in a different language, or recording in a different language.
Good question. Do you want to, just one more question here?
Hi. Hi. Hi, it's Jennifer. I just had a question, like often what may be important to the audience or the people or the community, say in Morocco or wherever, is not necessarily what's important to, say, the wider international community, and how you sort of square that, that difference, make you stay true to the people that you've spoken to, but also bring it to an international audience.
Great. Ida, do you want to take the question around languages?
Oh, yeah, the second one.
Yes.
That's a great question. That's a great question, because I always try to push. Let's say if someone calls me from Paris and they're like, "Can you do this?" I'm like, "I'm not," but I know this great person. He doesn't speak French, he doesn't speak English, but I promise, like, he's going to do an amazing work. Just bear with them and translate them. It's going to be a much better story than if you get someone in Paris who doesn't know Morocco and they're trying to write it just because they have the language. I think it's really about starting the conversation with editors. One way around it is just pairing up. If someone, and I think Abdi and I, and maybe to have done it many times, is we work with someone, we kind of do the writing, but the other person does the reporting, and we work together, and that's collaborative work. Like, you can, I think two people can do a great story together. One can take care of the writing, and the other one can take care of the reporting. That's one way, I think, to
Yeah. No, in terms of like just the question around language and collaboration, I think it's something that, because I cover 13 different countries with, like, you know, people, almost 500 million people who speak multiple languages, hundreds of ethnicities. And so in many ways, like, you are deeply dependent on the people who you are working with in those countries. And at any given point, you can only be somewhere, right? Like, we are all locked out of Sudan right now, but that story is still very important. We still have to report it out. We still have to talk to people on the ground. We still have to, like, you know, the veracity, the fact checking. So in that sense, a collaboration is happening. I think one thing that I do also when I travel to the ground and, like, I'm with a local reporter and, like, we are doing a story that we have to file from where we are. Some of the things that I do is that because maybe I don't speak the language and then we're going around talking to as many people as possible, the evening before I write the story, I usually sort of like have a conversation, and I'm like, so what did we experience? Who are the people we talked to? Who do you think is the most interesting? And we sort of, and I show them, like, all the ways in which, like, we're thinking about, so this is going to be the lead. This scene was very interesting. What popped at you? What quote was the greatest? And then sort of like just showing them that, I think it really just helps, like, when people have that visual of, like, they just don't think you go into a room and then something beautiful comes out. And then, of course, to always remind people that to write is human, to edit is divine. That you can write, that's not my quote, it's a Stephen King quote, but that you can write as much as you want, but, like, it's also like a collaborative process. There are tons of editors, there are tons of people who are, like, always looking at it. And I was wondering if you want to take the question on collaboration, maybe? Asta?
Yeah. I think both collaboration and how to empower, I guess, local journalists. I mean, what I've noticed in the last few years is that there actually has been a lot of effort in trying to get local journalists. So I'm thinking of who Time works with a lot, which is the Fuller Project. The Fuller Project is amazing because it actually gets lots of local journalists covering gender and human rights and pairs them with international publications. And in that process, they do get this exposure to editing from an international publication, as well as all the different steps that go from reporting to publishing. And I think there probably just needs to be more of those networks, but also there needs to be more encouragement, because oftentimes I still think local journalists feel like journalists from their communities feel like they can't pitch to those publications because they don't have the experience. And actually I don't even think that's the purpose of these structures in the first place. They actually want new voices. They want to enable people who haven't had the experience to do it. But if they are going to approach someone like myself, then I think all we can do is really say, like, you know, give me your pitch and I'll pass it to my editor, or like, here are some resources that you can access, like the Fuller Project. You know, I would encourage you to listen to this podcast or join this. I mean, these are all things that I did when I was starting out. You know, I started listening to every podcast, including one with Azmat on it. Like, I started like looking at what networks existed on Twitter, like which editor was asking for pitches, and then kind of started to like reach out to people and just asking them for advice. It's all very scary stuff, but now that I'm in this position, feel very grateful that things worked out for me in some way, and want to kind of pass that information on to whoever needs it. So I feel like it's really important to keep doing that constantly, because part of the problem is that even though there are all of these resources out there, I think people who are just starting out, they don't really know how to access them. So I think that that's really important to kind of pass that information on.
I'll actually take Jen's question on making stories relevant internationally, because I think as a reporter for like an international publication, that is sort of tricky. And you know, recently when I was in India, the thing is, when anything happens in India, it like affects millions of people, which in India is like a small wedding. But you know, for a lot of people around the world, it's like, oh my God, this happened. But I think the trick is really to have that balance. And usually, you know, in a 2.5 minute story, you have like a case study. So you begin sort of locally. You know, in print or in broadcast, it really annoys me when the first soundbite or the first quote you see is not from someone either affected or from there. Like, you have an expert. I'm like, why is this the first thing that I'm hearing? Like, they can be right up top. So start with that. But I think you sort of expand to make sure that, you know, someone sitting in, say, Zimbabwe, or someone sitting in, say, Netherlands, is engrossed, and that is where the art of storytelling really comes in, and you have to sort of squeeze it in 2.5 minutes. But you know, you're there, you're on ground, you want to find that story, because if they're flooding in Assam, then you want to go and find someone who's actually affected, and then sort of zoom out to climate crisis and how it's affecting the region and therefore the world and all of that. So it is a tricky balance, but well, that's the job.
I'll also add to that, and it's also something that I think a local journalist can learn, which is writing for, as we say, our reader in the Upper West Side. And it's really something that you learn, you know? Like, I know how to talk about Morocco for someone who's not from Morocco, and I know how to talk about Morocco for someone who's from Morocco. And I deeply think that someone who's from somewhere is able to write that international story. I'm sure of that. I think it's just about learning, and of course there are a lot of local journalists who don't understand international news and don't understand that maybe the story is great, but it's great for your local paper in Marrakesh or wherever, but it's not going to work for an international audience. But there are also as many local journalists who really understand how to write that story in a way that is universal and works for people outside of it.
Well, thanks for asking that question, Jen. I think it's very important to know that, you know, there's the adage around when it bleeds, it leads. Right? And like, you know, there's all these stories that, you know, everybody's focused on, and it's major crises, but it's also very important to realize that these communities that we are reporting from and these countries that we are flying into to write about these crises, they're also people who live there. There are ways in which they're living. There are all these ways in which they're thriving. And I think it's important. I'm not saying like we write positive stories for the sake of it, but it's also important to like bring out those stories, right? Just today when we were having a conversation half an hour ago, I realized that and Ida here wrote a story in 2014 that opened a whole new world for me and introduced me to this incredible writer that I love, and I did not realize that she's the one who wrote that story. So, so it's very important to like, you know, write up, you know, those stories, and I think it's not just gloom and doom. There's so much around there. We'll take another.
Can I just actually make an addition to what I was saying is, about making things internationally relevant. I've had many conversations as a journalist in American newsrooms when they're covering, say, elections in some part of the world, and they always want to find, like, no offense, but like a New York Times reporter from there, and I'm like, look, the person's great, but why don't you find someone who is from that place and is like a national editor or someone senior then, and the response I would often get is, well, they may not be able to make things relevant for the American audience. And I was like, well, I work here and I'm not American, like, can I take this personally? But it's also like, what does that even mean? You know, are you trying to say that the audience will not, like, what is it that they won't understand? And I get some, and I think it then comes down to how your anchor is questioning that expert. But I also think that, you know, when we're talking about local journalists, it's not just in our stories, but also experts that we sort of promote, and who is speaking for that community, which sometimes is just big nations and big regions at international platforms, especially in broadcast.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what you're saying also is like, that's an editor's choice. And I feel like if someone here is an editor, then it's like very important to think about how we frame things, because I truly don't think that any story is too local to be international. Like, I've had stories that I've pitched that were hyper local, but the BBC took it because they thought it was interesting. And I think a lot of that just comes to like how you frame things and, you know, what an editor is thinking about a story. And I think we just need to encourage more editors who may not necessarily have that diverse perspective to see a story as international.
Great. We'll take another round of questions. There's one question. Yeah. 10 minutes.
Yes, thanks for your remarks. I think that one of the most significant parts of Perugia is that it's open to all in the community, especially students. And I won't put anyone out, but there's some students in the room, and I think they'd be really interested to know something that surprised you since you were a student that is kind of connecting you to today's conversation.
Any other question? Yeah, there's one in the back.
Hello, my name's Michelle. I'm a TV producer. I used to work at ITV in the UK, but now work for the UN agency EFAD here in Rome. So I've seen things from both sides of things in terms of pitching and doing stories. I've been out in the field to some countries and obviously dealt with local fixers and local journalists. I'd just like to know your experiences of situations where culturally maybe you've got it wrong when you've been trying to do a story, and the conflicts that you've faced and how you resolved those. I just wanted, around gender, around sort of interviewing women, around interviewing different types of people from different regions. Just some examples, please. Thank you.
I think we can end with those two questions because they're very incredibly complex and difficult. Who wants to jump in first? Something that surprised you as a student.
So I work with students a lot, so maybe I should answer this question. I think it's a hard one. It's a hard question because putting me on the spot here. I think some of the things is maybe that I wish I knew and I didn't is the reason I got into journalism is because I had two passions in life, writing and traveling. And I know it's not like, I wish I said no. I actually paid very close attention to current affairs when I was 8. No, I just liked writing and I liked traveling, and I made a very calculated career choice that would really feed these two passions of mine. And then I got into it. And then when I got into it, it became such a huge responsibility. And it became 99% of my life. Like I can't be a journalist from 8 to 5, and then from 5 on, and on the weekends I'm something else. It impacts every aspect of my life. It impacts my family, how I behave on social media, what I can say, what I cannot say. It impacts how I behave when I'm having coffee with people I don't know, what I'm saying. So it's like, it becomes such a huge responsibility because you're the bearer of so much responsibility. You're telling stories, you're commenting on current events, you're commenting on politics, on laws, on very sensitive issues that impact so many people. So I think you have to be so ready to be in that, and you have to love it. you really have to love it. And I think it's one of the greatest jobs in the world. And I'm so happy I'm doing this. And even if sometimes it's hard, it's so much more rewarding than hard. So but I think you have to like really know what you're getting yourself into.
Yeah, I can answer that one as well, which is when I started out, I think you obviously don't choose this profession for the money. So
yes, that too.
So you're kind of thinking to yourself, I'm going to become this award-winning journalist tomorrow. Like, I'm going to find that story and I'm going to, change the world. And it is just a really long learning process, and I'm still learning, and you just have to be patient and be willing to learn, I guess. Because when I look at my pictures from like 5 years ago, I had no idea what I was doing, and every story that I've written since has taught me to make my pitch or my story just a little bit better. But you just need to have patience. You're not going to become a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist tomorrow.
Do you want to take the question around getting things wrong and how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I'm a little scared to admit mistakes. No, I'm not. I'm joking. I think in television, especially because you have a television background, what happens is by the time you leave the airport, leave for the airport, and by the time you land, the story has often moved. So in that respect, also working with a good producer really helps. Like, for example, recently, the government in India's northeast arrested about 3,000 men, largely men, for child marriage. And so it's obviously a big story, and that's what we went to cover. But by the time we landed and we met the families of those people, we realized that a lot of those marriages were actually consensual. It wasn't like they were forced to get married. The second thing is, by then it had changed from the arrest to actually the impact, because a lot of these people came from rural areas, and the women were like, look, I understand that this could be illegal, but you have to understand that it's me and my child, and now we don't have an earning member of the family. And we were working with someone who works for a national publication in that region, and like, she was moonlighting, so I can't take her name, and I couldn't even tag her on Instagram. But just having her, and because she had done her research and had done that story, she was able to sort of talk to those women, translate for me. We were sitting there, we actually hung out with them for hours, and we got the story that worked. And then we actually aired the story 2 days late, because that's when I think the Turkey earthquake happened. So we couldn't air the story, but our story remained relevant. So that really helped. Then there was another instance where I went to India's western state, where there was a disease called lumpy cow disease. So thousands of cattle were actually affected, and that affects local livelihoods and the economy, because so many people depend on cattle. And I'd read all these pieces about the disease, and I was there as like this big health animal expert. And then when I was talking to like the local vets there, they said, the information is wrong. This disease was basically, used to affect goats a lot, and now it's affecting cows, so that's different. And that was the first time I heard it, and I said, okay, well, this is in my stand-up, and I only have like half an hour to get it approved from the sub-editor, and if I've recorded it, I wouldn't have an option. And I made some other calls right there, and so I left all my research, we did that, and I was a bit nervous, I'll be honest, and I think till to date, very few publications actually picked up on that fact, but I think just having someone with you and sort of unlearning what you've read on the plane sometimes can help. So I sort of stuck to my guns, and those were my victories.
Amazing. Well, I think that's a great place to end. Thank you, Asta. Thank you, Pavni. Thank you, Aida. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Abdi.